My name is Ron Szymusiak, and I'm editor-in-chief of the journal Sleep, and I'm going to talk to you about reviewing papers for scientific journals. I assume that most of you viewing this webinar are early in your careers, so I will attempt to touch on all the major aspects of reviewing manuscripts for journals. I also hope that many of you will review papers for the journal Sleep throughout your career. So in some places, I'll use examples for the peer review process, from the peer review process at Sleep, but much of what I will say will be applicable to other journals. So what are the reasons to review papers for journals? So there are a group of reasons that I refer to as altruistic, and essentially constitutes service to the field. You contribute to the quality control of the published literature in your area of research. Authors improve their manuscripts and help editors make an informed decision on manuscripts. So as a volunteer peer reviewer, you really are the foot soldiers of the peer review process, and journals really couldn't make informed decisions on manuscripts without your input. There are also several selfish reasons to review for journals. By reviewing papers, you learn how to write better papers. You learn how to effectively revise your papers and how to respond to reviewers and editors, because you will see in the review process how the authors respond, how the different reviewers and the editors interpret those responses. So you're able to go behind the curtain a little bit when you participate in reviewing papers. It's also expected of you. Effective participation in peer review is an important part of your professional development and academic success. Editors take notice of willing, effective, and prompt reviewers. You really are an asset to the journal that you review for. Manuscript review sites allow editors to track individual reviewer performance. So at Sleep, we rate reviewers on their performance. And if you have a history as an outstanding reviewer for a journal, you might be asked to serve on the editorial board in a later stages of your career as associate editors or as editors. So how do you decide whether or not to accept or decline a request to review from a journal? And you should ask yourself 3 basic questions. First is, do I have the necessary expertise and interest in the topic to review the manuscript? Second is, do I have conflicts of interest with any of the authors? And that would include things like recent history of collaboration, someone that's in your institution or department, or if you have intellectual conflict of interest, where you have different opinions on the scientific issues that may impact your ability to give an fair and unbiased review of the paper. And finally, do you have time to complete the review by the due date? So if you answer yes, no, yes to those 3 questions, then you should seriously consider reviewing the paper. So what aspects of the paper are you expected to review? And the answer is essentially including the title. So things to ask yourself about the title is, does the title accurately reflect what is reported in the manuscript? Does the title imply findings or significance of findings that go beyond the study design or the data? Does the title exaggerate the scope of the research findings? Abstract. Does the abstract effectively summarize the entire manuscript, the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion? It should contain a concise statement of the problem and rationale for the approach. Are the main research findings accurately described in the abstract? And is the description of the findings clear and concise? Do the conclusions stated in the abstract accurately reflect the findings? Is the significance of the findings overstated? Now, when I give instructions for people writing papers, I always advise them to make the strongest possible concluding statement based on their data in the abstract. Sometimes in the context of doing that, authors can go a little over the top, and it's up to the reviewers to rein them in if they are overstating the aspects of the findings in the abstract. Introduction. Is the research question, is the research question or questions original and important? The state of knowledge in the area of investigation adequately and concisely described? Relevant literature accurately summarized? Are the research question and the underlying hypothesis clearly stated? You'd be surprised how often there is not a clear statement of the research objectives or the hypothesis. And at some point you begin making a judgment, is the paper appropriate for the journal that you're reviewing for? Methods. So you look for basic things like subject recruitment and selection criteria adequately described. Are there any issues relating to ethical conduct of research on humans or animals? The method should contain a clear statement of compliance with institutional regulatory committees. Are the methods, protocols, and data analysis clearly described? You should identify missing information or aspects of the description of the methods that are confusing or ambiguous. And it's sort of a rule of thumb is that if you can't understand what is being explained in the methods, chances are that significant numbers of readers will have the same problem. So you should ask the authors to address your source's confusion about the description of the methods. Methods and protocols and analyses be understood without reference to previous publications. So for example, at SLEEP, there are no strict page limits on article length, so there's no reason for the authors to leave out important methodological details. Readers should not be tasked with having to dig through, find articles and read them, published articles and read them to understand the methods. Not everyone has broad expertise in statistical methods. That includes me. And so if there are aspects of the analyses that are beyond your level of expertise, you should include a statement of that in your review. And at SLEEP, we have the ability to seek a specialized statistical review if the reviewers identify concerns that they feel they don't have the expertise to address. Results. Are they appropriately organized into subsections? Is there excessive duplication of results reported in the text and in the figures and tables? Are findings that are non-significant according to statistical analysis described as borderline significant or trends? They're not. They're non-significant, and you should not let authors refer to non-significant findings as trends. Please check figures and figure legends carefully. There are often mistakes, inconsistencies there. Are all components of the figures legible and understandable? Does the figure legend adequately explain the figure, including providing all abbreviations? Because as a rule of thumb, when evaluating figures and tables, that the figures in the legend should be able to stand alone without having to refer back and forth to the text, because that facilitates understanding of the data. If supplemental materials are provided, and SLEEP, along with many journals, accept supplemental materials, is that material a useful adjunct to understanding what is presented in the main results? Is information in the supplemental materials provided there that is essential to understanding the findings of the main findings of the paper, and should therefore be incorporated into the main results section? How carefully are you required to review supplemental materials? Supplemental materials consist of a few additional figures and tables. The guidelines would be that you should review them to the same extent that you're reviewing materials in the main section of the paper. However, if someone is presenting large databases or large tables that would only be of interest to a restricted number of reviewers, you would not be required to review large pieces of supplemental materials in any detail. Discussion. Is the scope of the discussion appropriate? Is it confined to the main research findings and integrating them with the existing literature? Claims made in the discussion that go beyond the data. All studies have limitations, and all discussion sections should include at least a brief and honest discussion of the limitations of the interpretation of the findings. Within reason, it's appropriate for you to request additional points that should be addressed in the discussion section. And within reason, again, it's appropriate for you to recommend shortening the discussion section, either specific sections, or if you have a feeling that the discussion section just goes on and on by some overall percent. Okay, so strategies for preparing to write your review. So this will be a process as you go through your career. You will develop your own style and approach as you do more reviews. Most reviewers will read the manuscript the first time all the way through, from abstract through discussion, to form an overall impression of the paper. I've reviewed papers for over 30 years, and that's still my initial approach to a paper. But my advice is to try and make the most of that first read through the manuscript. But for example, by annotating the PDF, when I review, I use the little post-it note features of Adobe Acrobat frequently. Write your first impressions of big issues like strengths and weaknesses of the rationale and the approach, and on smaller points, such as aspects of the methods that need verification, as well as minor text edits. Also, when you read through the manuscript the first time, this might identify any concerns you have that might require you to do a brief literature search and look at a few published papers if you aren't certain about certain points that you might want to critique in the article. Sorry. Okay. Before you begin writing your critique, you might need a second careful reading of the complete paper to consolidate your opinions, or you may just want to revisit the portions that you've highlighted and annotated. So my personal experience is that if I do a good job of marking up the PDF with comments, and as I'm writing those comments in the PDFs, I'm trying to write them in a way that can be relatively easily cut and pasted into the critique. So if I do that, then I've done a lot of the work of getting the critique written. Most journals do not have a specific organization requirements for the narrative portion of a review, but if it's your first time reviewing for a journal, there are instructions for reviewers to make sure. Writing your review. So it's common to begin a review with a brief summary of the scientific question, the approach, and the major findings and conclusions. Even if your enthusiasm for the paper is low, you should try to say something positive at the beginning, even if it's a generic statement like the study addresses an important problem. It's important, particularly in the first submission, to refrain from using language in the review that reflects your recommendation to revise or accept. It's the editors that make those decisions and communicate them to the authors. Particularly with the first submission, you don't know what the opinion of the other reviewers is. So if you are highly enthusiastic and say this paper deserves to be accepted and the other reviewer or reviewers recommend reject, it makes it a little more difficult for the editors to write a strong decision letter of reject to the authors. So if you really admire a paper and want to give the authors positive feedback. You can do that in your review of the revision, when you have a better understanding of how the paper has been evaluated by everyone involved in the evaluation, you, the other reviewers, and the editors. While it's not mandatory, as I mentioned, at most journals, you should consider structuring your review somehow, for instance, with headings on significance of the question, you know, and the novelty of the hypotheses, strengths and weaknesses of the approach and the methods, comments on the results, again, strengths and weaknesses, discussion, and then the overall presentation of the paper. Is it clearly organized? Is the use of English language up to the journal standards, are tables and figures appropriate? Always try to designate your comments and concerns as major or minor whenever possible. Be clear, make specific recommendations to the authors, say what you want them to do and why. You should be careful of your language and always try to keep a collegial tone in your reviews. You shouldn't be disrespectful to authors or dismissive of their work. The best practice is, I believe, that even though your review is going to be, your comments are going to be shared with the author, you should write those comments as if you were addressing the editor and refer to the paper and its authors in the third person. This just makes the tone of the review a little more neutral. For instance, if the critique is relatively negative, rather than saying you did this wrong, you didn't explain this clearly, it's better to it feels less confrontational if you just refer to the authors in the third person. And always avoid use of value judgments and value-laden adjectives. Use neutral language whenever possible. Be brief and concise. Focus on the major strengths and weaknesses of the paper. This will help the editors make a decision and the authors focus on the important aspects of the paper to revise. The best reviews are usually 1 or 2 single-spaced pages and fewer than 1,000 words. Certainly at SLEEP, we do not expect you to be a copy editor. If English grammar and spelling is poor, suggest that the authors seek the assistance of a native English speaker or a professional editor rather than attempting to edit the poor grammar on your own. If the writing is so poor that you cannot adequately review the manuscripts, as grounds for rejection. Now, those kinds of manuscripts probably won't get to you as a reviewer. They will have been filtered out earlier in the editorial process, either by the managing editor, editor-in-chief, or one of the associate editors. Submitting your review. So most journals have a series of questions for you to answer. Some of these will be sort of routine yes, no, in terms of usually relating to regulatory concerns. But there also are often ratings of the quality of the paper in terms of the novelty, significance, and importance. Some journals ask you to rank the paper in the, in a percentile, top 10, top 20, or so on, of the papers that you have read. And those kind of questions you should answer thoughtfully and carefully because they can play a role in the final editorial decision. Many journals allow you to provide optional confidential comments to editors that are not shared with the authors. And SLEEP does that. So at SLEEP, it's optional. You're required to provide comments to the authors. There's an optional box for you to provide comments to the editors. And in certain instances, these can be helpful. For instance, this is a place where you can tell the editors specifically if there are aspects of the manuscript that sufficient expertise to review. So for instance, if your expert is cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience and sleep, and you're reviewing a paper that looks at the, those aspects, but also includes a brain imaging component, you can tell the editors that you don't really have the expertise to review the brain imaging aspect, and your comments to your areas of expertise, and that's perfectly acceptable. And again, as I mentioned before, there may be issues with statistical analyses where you might suggest that you don't have the expertise to evaluate, and the editors might want to seek expert statistical evaluation, which we will do at SLEEP. In fact, have even a check mark for you to request or suggest that the manuscript undergoes statistical review. This is also a place for you to communicate to the editor your enthusiasm for the paper, and here you can make comments about your opinions of whether it's suitable for publication. For example, sometimes I'll see comments like, I was on the fence about recommending reject or major revision for this paper. So you don't want to say that in the review, but it's helpful to communicate that to the editors, because if the other reviewer is also on the fence or has a recommendation to reject, it can help the reviewers, the editors, get a clear vision of their decision for the paper. You can also make more positive comments like, this is going to be an important paper if adequately revised. That's not, necessarily want to say that again in the first review of a first submission, but it's important to let the editors know that you think highly of the paper and would improve your score if it was adequately revised. Okay, so again, assuming that most of you are early in your peer review careers, how do you get started reviewing for journals? And one common way is mentored reviews. So like many journals, SLEEP will accept mentored reviews. And what a mentor review involves is that your mentor is invited to review a paper in the normal way by the journal, decides that they want to review the paper, and chooses to involve you as their trainee or mentee in the review process. Your mentor may have you write all or a portion of the review and give you feedback in terms of helping you construct a final review together with the mentor. So at SLEEP, the expectation is that for mentored reviews, the level of guidance and input provided by the mentor is such that the quality of the submitted review should be equal to that of a review done by the mentor alone. So if you have not engaged in this kind of activity with your mentor, you might suggest to them that they consider including you as part of a mentored review in the next paper they receive from SLEEP.
Oh, did you have an email from her?
Yes.
At SLEEP, we also have what we call the Reviewer in Training Initiative. And this is a way to get postdocs and senior graduate students who have some peer review experience, either in the context of having first authored a paper or two, or perhaps maybe having done some reviews with their mentor, and to provide them with a path to become an independent, regular ad hoc reviewer for SLEEP and part of our reviewer database, Manuscript Central Scholar One. So if you're accepted into this Reviewer in Training Initiative, you will be asked to log on to Scholar One and create a reviewer account and designate your areas of expertise. We have a way to identify you as a reviewer in training in the database, and you will initially be signed as a third reviewer for manuscripts, along with two regular, more senior expert reviewers. And once you submit your reviews, they will be evaluated by the associate editor and the editor-in-chief, and will provide you feedback and we'll provide you with feedback on your review. You will also get to see the decision letter and the comments of the other reviewers. So after 2 to 3 satisfactory training reviews, you will then be designated as an regular ad hoc reviewer for the journal. So if you are interested in becoming a reviewer in training at SLEEP, just send me your CV bio sketch, and I'll confirm your eligibility and follow up with you. So thank you for your attention. I hope that you will become involved with the journal, and if you feel you're qualified, that you'll inquire about the Reviewer in Training initiative, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.